Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. This event is part of our Good Lit series, underwritten by the Bernard Osher Foundation. And we are going to talk about Escape from Alcatraz, but not the movie. The real thing. And it's a fascinating thing, and for those of you who didn't read the details, Ken Widner here is the nephew of the two of the three men who escaped. This is Mike Lynch, his fellow author of the book, and has been working on the project for several years now, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're going to go and find out what it was like to grow up in Panhandle, Florida, right? For your uncles, or?
Well, for me, it was South Georgia.
South Georgia.
For them, it was Middle Florida.
Middle Florida.
Yep.
And to go from being juvenile delinquents, enjoying themselves, to robbing a bank with a toy gun, and the rest of the time they spent in and out of prison escaping, and they got really good at it.
They did.
They did. So, welcome to the Commonwealth Club. Thanks for joining us. So, Ken, obviously relatives, but how did you then become so involved in trying to get the real answer to what had happened?
Well, as far as the Alcatraz story, I've always been a part of the story. My life began when I was a year and a half old with the story when they escaped. And, I'm watching it with my mom. Of course, I didn't realize what was on TV at the time. But as she watches, her two brothers' posters flash upon the screen. So I was kind of like born into this story. And pretty much like any kid growing up, when I was in middle school and high school, I didn't talk too much about it. I was one of those kids that wanted to get through school. I didn't want to draw a lot of attention to myself, like typical kids. And, only my close friends kind of knew some of the story. My real desire that I got pulled in was in 2012. Mm-hmm. I brought my mom and her sister, who are the only two living relatives or siblings, out to Alcatraz. We were coming out here for the 50th anniversary. Mm-hmm. We were invited, and they were going to do a big press conference on the island. And I have the photo of us actually doing the press conference. And the U.S. Marshal, who they were working with me at that time, he's sitting in between us, and my mom and my aunt, my brother was on one side, and on the other side were two individuals. One was a former guard, and the other one was a person that writes a book for Alcatraz. Well, they make a very disparaging comment about my uncles. She makes, and I say she, I meant to say they, makes a comment that, Frank Morris was the brains behind this outfit. He's the one who planned everything. And my uncles were a bunch of third grade educated men that were lucky to be included. And I became so furious. I told my wife, if that U.S. Marshal had not been between me and them,
you would have ended up in Alcatraz yourself.
I would have probably been in Alcatraz myself.
What you're going to do, yeah.
So I said right then, I said, I just do not believe, of all the stories that I knew about my uncles, I did not believe that that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And so I said, I'm going to make it my life mission to figure out exactly what happened. I want the true story. I didn't believe what was being said. And so all the way up until 2015, I, poked around at different things. I had a copy of the FBI files, and, eventually I did the Alcatraz Search for the Truth with the History Channel. I met another famous U.S. Marshal, and from there, I really started digging. I found one key piece of evidence that he shared with me, and that turned the whole story into what it became. I mean, I actually wrote a screenplay to begin with, and then Mike, introduced himself to me much later on and convinced me to take that screenplay because it was very poorly written. I'm not a writer. I tried, and he convinced me to turn it into a book, and that's where it kind of came. A short story. So.
Yeah. Right. So how'd you get pulled into this besides the fact that you thought the screenplay needed to be revised?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking to Ken.
No. Sorry.
I just have to apologize. I have a little bit of a cold, so my voice is a little raspy. So when Ken did the documentary with the History Channel in 2015, I saw the promo for it. I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. I think I want to watch that because I've been interested in Alcatraz just over the years because I love a good mystery. I mean, most of us do. I saw the Clint Eastwood movie that he made back in '79, Escape from Alcatraz, and in that story, as Ken was alluding to, Frank Morris was the hero of the story. And, John and Clarence were just sort of the followers. They just sort of kind of did his bidding in the movie. And then, of course, at the end, they leave the ending a little ambiguous. Did they make it? Did they not make it? Because obviously, no one knew at the time what had happened. So they just sort of left it open-ended. And when I saw in the documentary that he did, when they produced the photograph, the 1975 photograph that their childhood friend Fred Breezy had provided, and then they had done facial recognition analysis, and he's a very high-ranking person at the time before he retired from the U.S. Marshals. When he said that that was a positive match of John, I thought, okay, I want to be a part of this story. But I didn't know who Ken was. I'm living out here in California. At the time, he was living in Georgia. And I had to track him down. And so I finally found him online, and I introduced myself. I said, I'm a writer. I saw your documentary. I want to be a part of the story. I think there's a story here to tell that's bigger than I had realized. And it took a bit of convincing, about a year, for Ken to finally trust me, because I didn't know at the time that over the years with his family, that when the escape happened for his uncles, the family was on the FBI's watch list at that point, and there was a lot of harassment, intimidation, phone taps, a lot of surveillance by the FBI, and then later the U.S. Marshals on his family, and he didn't know if I was a part of that because he didn't know who he was. But after a bit of time, when he finally felt that he can trust me, then he sent his screenplay, and I said, yeah, this is going to need some work. And then later, when he told me more of the stories, I thought, okay, this is more than a movie. This is bigger than that. And so we have to find the medium in which we can tell the entire story.
So now, Ken, your family, you have a big family. Your uncles are 2 of the 14 siblings.
Yes.
Right. And your mother is maybe a much younger sister?
Yeah, so John is number 6 in the lineup. Clarence is number 7, and my mother is number 10.
10, okay.
So yeah, very large family, 7 boys and 7 girls.
Wow.
Yeah, we used to always joke with my grandmother, she was either in the kitchen or she was having children.
One or the other.
One or the other.
Well, I'm wondering, at the 50th anniversary when you went out, you were asked to come out. In the book you mentioned this, because they thought you might still be in contact with them. They wanted to, with your uncles. So was anybody in the family upset that you were cooperating or bringing attention to this in case your uncles were still alive? I mean, your uncles had to be in their late 80s at the time or something like that. So that's the youngest they could be.
Yeah. Later we would find out, and we suspected this early on, even when I was a teenager, we always used to say if anyone knew anything about where they went, it was their older brother, Robert. Now, we always referred to him as Uncle Man. And for years, I always thought that was his name, was Man. And I even asked my mom, where did that name come from? She said, I have no clue. But we always referred to him as Man. And when I found his draft card where he fills out selective service, he even wrote Man. Then he had to scratch through it. His real name was Robert Anglin. But so when I refer to him, I always usually say Uncle Man. But
is it
we
because
find
he
out
was the man in the family, or
he was the 3rd family member because he was 4th because Alfred was number 5, so he was right in front of Alfred, and he would have been part of that group. They were very mischievous children at that time, and he would have been part. He even says, "I would have been a part of it," but we later find out, and we always suspected that he was part of somehow this escape. Not so much that he went out there, but he knew where they were at. And he was the one who was feeding them information about the family. He kept them updated on family events and what happened throughout the years. And later on his deathbed in 2009, he even confesses that, 2010, that he had been in contact with them for 25 years. And he kept update. So he would have probably been the one that would have looked down on us cooperating with, because you got to remember when the FBI shows up at the house the very next day after the escape, him and his wife at that time were living with my grandmother. And he has said many times, they came in the door, they did not knock, they didn't, announce themselves. They came into the living room where they were sitting at, demanded everybody, don't move. He was about to get up. They threw him back onto the couch and said, you're not going anywhere until you answer every one of our questions. They threatened over the years every single family member, if you have any knowledge of where they're at, if we find out you participated in any form, shape, or fashion, you're going to prison. And so, here is a very, very poor family who had no means to hire anybody to defend them. And you've got the head federal government, the FBI, coming into your house and threatening you with jail time. Of course, no one's going to say anything. And so he was very protective of his family, of his brothers and sisters, especially his mom and dad. So he kept everything to himself all the way up until the point of his death in 2010. And he tells my mom and my sister, or her sister, that he had been in contact with them. And then later, as we start doing our research, we find out why they were so interested in him. Of all the family members that they interrogated or interviewed, he is the only family member that was ever polygraphed by the FBI twice. Everybody else they didn't do anything with. He's the only one they focused on. I could never understand why. Why was he so important? That they realized this until we found this document in the FBI file, the 17 volumes, where right after the escape, he goes to visit the other brother in Atlanta, and he tells him that not only did they survive, but he tells who helps in the escape. And so they've had this document for years. We didn't know about it until the public had access to it. And it is actually redacted until I had a friend in the Marshal Services give me the copy. And so all this time they knew it was him. And so that started making sense. Why were they focusing on him? And that was the reason why.
For the audience, you're going to end up liking a couple of bank robbers a whole lot by the time we finish the story. So I think it's important to kind of understand what their crimes were, what their actual crimes were,
Right.
how they got in their trouble, and that they were in their 20s being very mischievous, still breaking out of prison all the time. But what were their actual crimes? Talk a little bit about their juvenile delinquent crimes.
So they
not
would,
going to school.
they would start out as skipping school. Truant officer would come in, and they would wind up going to reform schools or boys' school. And every time they put them in there, they would just escape. And they came to know where they were going to be at.
At the age of 8, 9, 10, right?
Oh my gosh, 8, 9, 10. They were in reform schools. They couldn't keep them in there. And my grandmother would just plead with the school system, please don't put my children in, and they would take them away sometimes to faraway places. They even went to Marianna, Florida, where later on we find this is the industrial school for boys that wound up years later, like in the late, 2010, that there were many, many boys that they found in mass graves. So a lot of abuse that occurred at that time frame. But even still, as they would escape, they learned, I just had to go back home, because every time they escaped, they went home. And, there were stories of them walking in the door and at breakfast time, and a little while later, they would come pick them up and take them back. And, so they started off kind of like that. And eventually, they go into this, whatever reason, and we tell you in the book, that they decided to rob a bank, which was way over the head because everything else was just petty crime, stealing a battery out of a car and selling it, or breaking into a hardware store and stealing something. Very petty type stuff. And they would spend time in state prisons, in Florida, escaped many times from there. Alcatraz was definitely not their first escape. And so, they get caught robbing a bank. And what is so amazing about their federal trial is that it's just a few days after they catch them. They robbed the bank in like January of 1958. They catch them a few days later in Ohio because John is with a married woman who her husband turns him in. I know, this gets even better. But he was truly in love with this woman. And it's really, later on, you'll learn some more details about this lady. But so anyway, they get sent to, they go to Alabama to stand trial for their federal charge. And no joking, I mean, we have the manuscript. They tried, convicted them, and sentenced them in the same day, the exact same day. And they wound up going to Atlanta 2 days later to start serving their, John got 10 years. Alfred and Clarence gets 15 years because they were already escaped from another prison when they robbed the bank. So they were adding time on for that. And 2 days later, the state of Alabama said, nope, that's not good enough. They bring them back to Alabama just 2 days after they get to Atlanta, and they want to give them the death penalty because the state of Alabama, they can charge you with death, sentence you to the electric chair for robbing a bank. And that's what they wanted to do. But in the end, a really good story about how they were able to hire a lawyer. They get 25 years each on top of what they did for their federal. And from that point on is when they start, nope, not going to have this. And from one prison to the next prison, they try different escape attempts all the way up until they land into Alcatraz.
Where they think they can't escape. One of the nice details about the story is that when they robbed the bank, they gave $500 to a brother just in case it might come in handy, and they used that to pay the lawyer to get him out of the death penalty in Alabama.
That's
right?
what they used to hire the lawyer with.
Yeah, I thought, well, that's planning ahead. It shows that they were the ones that were planning ahead on these.
For whatever reason, John goes to Uncle Man, name again, and they're getting ready to flee to Ohio. They're eventually heading to Mexico with their girlfriends. And for some reason, he says, hey, I'm going to give you $500. I want you to hang on to it for me in case we need it. And my Uncle Man, this is a weird story, but he takes the heel of his shoe off. He puts 250 in one and 250 in the other. I guess that's how they keep money back then. And, when they get brought into into Alabama for their state trial, like I said, this family is poor. Now, I don't know if you know how poor is. You can take today's term of poor and multiply it by 100, and you hadn't even reached the bottom of where my grandmother and grandfather was. I mean, they were really, really poor. And so they had no money to defend their sons. And my grandfather was almost at the point where he was going to mortgage the farm. The only thing they had for income to hire a lawyer to defend his sons. And John goes, wait a minute. I gave man $500. And so my grandfather gets in touch with him, and he can't travel up. So my grandfather travels all the way down from Montgomery, Alabama to Ruskin, Florida to grab that $500. And on the way out of town, he stops at a lawyer's. He sees a lawyer's office and stops and talks and convinces him to defend his three sons for $500. And that's what saved their life. Otherwise, they would have been electrocuted.
Right. So they were still convicted, but they weren't given the death penalty for it. They were given another 25 years.
They were given 25 years and not to be served concurrently with their federal time.
And when they robbed the bank, they used a toy gun.
It was never presented to anywhere in the. It was never presented in the federal trial. In the state trial, it was a railroad. I mean, I could tell you when you read the book, you're going to hear some stories that actually occurred during that state trial. Think of in the 1958 time frame in southern Alabama. You can just imagine what kind of a trial this was in the courthouse. And, eventually when Alfred, who is the third brother, gets to Atlanta, he decides, for whatever reason, he's going to go the legal route to try to fight this. We even have the letters that he wrote the ACLU to try and get this overturned as double jeopardy. And while he's trying to do this, he writes the state of Alabama to get all of the documents from the trial, the transcripts. Well, the state of Alabama destroys them all. So he couldn't get any of them. And whoever heard of them destroying all of the evidence just months after the trial. So there's no evidence that exists anywhere other than we have the indictment where the state of Alabama indicted them. And we also have the list of the people that were on the jury and what they came back with the verdict. Other than that, that's it.
They only had one file cabinet. That's,
Yeah.
So there's one thing that among the mischief that they did, which I liked as boys, which eventually helped them in their escape from Alcatraz, which was, it reminded me of in the winter in Wisconsin, when snow came down, you could hook yourself onto the back bumper of a car and slide on your heels,
Right.
long after the car. So the boys, your uncles, when they were boys, would hook themselves onto the back of boats with a cord,
Yes.
and then zip along on the river
Yes.
that was nearby. So they end up using that. So why don't we show everybody?
Yeah. Well, this, of course, now, what you're looking at here, and I always like to, and I do want to get back to that story.
Yeah.
But most people, when they write, and you've read books about Alcatraz, they always start at Alcatraz because that's the story, Me and Mike chose not to start at Alcatraz because that's where everybody starts. We started this story from this photograph. I mean, this photograph, when I first gave it to the U.S. Marshals in 2015, after I discovered it, no one really kind of believed that this was Johnny Clarence in Brazil in 1975. I was really the only one who was saying, I'm telling you, that's my uncle, And so the U.S. Marshals during the show, and I actually won an 18 bottle of Macallan over this, because we had a wager in the background. So he goes out and hires the leading facial recognition person that was running, actually teaching this at the U.S. Marshal Services at the time in 2015. And if you watch the show, if you've ever seen the show, he comes back with an exact match on John. And then, it just blows everybody away. And so, one, this proves that they made it. And then we wanted to write the story of not did they make it, this proves they made it. We wanted to write the story on how did they get there? What brought them to Alcatraz to begin with? Because that's a story in itself. And then and then who helped them get out? And then where did they go after that? So, there's another story that's to be told in the near future of what occurs after you see this photograph.
Was this photograph, Mike, something that made you say, okay, there's a real story here and, we've got some real proof?
Well, when I was sharing earlier, when I saw the documentary in 2015, that's when I saw the photograph too. And when the facial recognition, Michael Streed, gave it a confirmation of, there's a very high likelihood. He didn't say it's John. He says it's a high likelihood that it's John because they deal in probabilities.
Yeah.
And he said that was a high probability that was John. Well, that's when I was saying to myself, there's more to the story here. There's going from Alcatraz in '62 when the escape occurred, and this photograph was taken around 1975. That's 13 years of what happened to them, and then after '75, what happened in their lives? Because obviously they're in a different country. Their clothing is very 1970s vintage. Clarence is a little harder to, because of the sunglasses and the hair and
in the way that, you can't really see his ears. He's got longer hair. But one of the dead giveaways is his cigarettes in his pocket. He always carries his cigarettes in his pockets.
Yeah. So anyway, it was just like, I want to be a part of the wider story and I want to know what really happened to them. That this was definitive evidence that it's not stories or friends of friends saying this is what happened. This is like actual proof that they survived. And when Art Roderick saw that photograph,
freaked him out.
Yeah, he said this is the first real evidence we've had of the escape or of them surviving the escape in 50 years. He was dumbfounded.
So before we get to Alcatraz and the nice elaborate plans that they did, which I think are fascinating core of the story, of course, but your uncles made friends with people, and they started to work for people while they were going up. They did this bank robbery because a business deal fell through because there was too much
Right.
heat
Right.
on Mickey Cohen.
Right.
Okay, so Mickey Cohen was a gangster, and that they had met him through something, and they flew out from Florida. Why don't you tell the story? They got to know him, and they've got this business deal going. Yeah.
Yeah. So to go back to that story, like I said, it's almost kind of like when you're putting together a puzzle, and you're looking for that one piece of the puzzle that you need, and then all of a sudden all these other little puzzle pieces start kind of going into place. And as I was trying to put this story together in my head in 2015, and I come across this document in the FBI files where it's my Uncle Man, and I can kind of paraphrase it a little bit. So they're interviewing Alfred's cellmate. This is after Alfred has been killed in prison.
Alfred is the
Alfred
other brother.
is the other brother.
Right in
There's
between
three of them that
Man
robbed the
and-
bank.
yeah.
Two of them winds up in Alcatraz. The other one eventually winds up in Kilby Prison, where he's killed. But when he's still in Atlanta, Uncle Man comes to see him, and his cellmate is saying, well, first of all, the brothers had notified him somehow that they were planning an escape, because he even said, that they let Alfred know that they were going to do an escape from Alcatraz, but Alfred didn't hold he didn't believe that it could be done. He didn't hold a lot to it. So then after
Why don't you tell them about how they communicated these things? The brothers had this secret.
they had
way
a
of-
secret code
Yeah.
of communicating with each other.
Which they did as boys.
lines, and they did it as kids. They had like the ways they could look at each other and they could say something without actually saying anything. They used to use, where we found out, this communication with 3 lines. One line meant, they were planning the escape. One line meant, and how high it went meant that they were doing different parts of the escape. They were getting ready, they were planning it, it was underway, and, I need help, whatever. But so right after, when it's being reported that they're drowned and they died, Alfred becomes very gloomy, according to his cellmate. Very gloomy, down, and which, you didn't think about, how would you feel if you just found out your brothers died, and you're really kind of the cause of why, because you're their older brother and you kind of led them down this path. So he's this way until Uncle Man comes to visit him. And not only did they said Alfred's changed, he became his old cheerful self again, he even tells his roommate or his cellmate, not only did they make it, but that Mickey Cohen supplied them a boat. And when I found that out, I was like, well, who the heck is Mickey Cohen? I didn't know who Mickey Cohen was. I was like, what does he have to do with this story? And so as we started digging into it, well, Mickey Cohen was sent to Alcatraz for tax evasion by the Kennedy brothers when they were in the Senate and Congress. I think he was I think it was senator. They got him in on a tax evasion charge. He's the only person in the history of Alcatraz to bond out of Alcatraz. He shows up, and get this, he shows up in like October of 61. He goes to work with John in the clothing room, and then he finds out he's going to be able to bond out $100,000. And but that's even a weird story, because guess who signs his bond? Now, if you were going to be, if you were in prison for whatever, and you was going to bond out, you would probably, and your lawyer had a good lawyer, he would go to the local federal judge, right? And if you can convince him to sign the bond, then you could get out. Oh, no. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, is the one who signs his bond. How crazy is that? How do you go and get the head of the Supreme Court of the United States to sign your bond to get you out of prison? So
When you're a known gangster.
when you're a known gangster.
Yeah.
So he's known he's fixing to leave. Well, all of the brothers, along with Frank Morris and Whitey Bulger, come to him and tell him, say, listen, when you get out, you need to flee to Brazil. You need to go marry a local Brazilian, have children, and they can never bring you back. But that's not what he did. He leaves, and 7 months later, he comes back. And they're all like totally crazy. And so he comes back, he goes back into the clothing room with John, working with John, and just a few weeks later, the escape occurs. What we later find out is when Uncle Man is telling, we're like, well, how does he know Mickey Cohen? What in the world, where did that come from? Mickey Cohen, when he got out on bond, either him or somebody else went to my Uncle Man and said, hey, your brothers are planning this escape, because it was already underway, and I'm going to supply them a boat. You're going to help me set stuff up. Their best friend, who later on you'll find out more about him, is actually the one who flew them out of the United States into Mexico and then eventually into Brazil. But he helped put all this together. And we then were like, how does all of this kind of fit together? And then we go back and we start looking in the history of my uncles. Well, heck, for some reason when they were like in 1957, they travel out to California. I mean, these are poor people now. I've got photos of them when they were in the car that day they were leaving, and they're dressed like when raggedy old type jeans. John didn't even have a shirt on. Their car is like really old looking, and they've got suitcases packed on the back of the car, and the car looks like it's really about a jalopy, like about to fall apart. But so they travel all the way to California, and they're gone for several weeks. And my mom said, no one in the family could figure out, why were they going to California? And when they come back, they have brand new cars. This is my mom saying, John walked in and he had a water cache. It was big enough to choke a horse. That's how she was. And then they all of a sudden, I've got pictures of them. We have photos of them, and they're dressed to the T. They're now dressing almost like gangsters. They have patent leather shoes on. They're all wearing these nice suits. You can see Clarence, he goes and gets a brand new, not Clarence, but John gets a brand new car. Clarence comes back from California with a brand new car. They all start buying these expensive stuff. Where did they get this from? And we later find out they were out there meeting with Mickey Cohen. This was not the first time they knew Mickey Cohen. Mickey was actually going to hire them. They were in the drug business. They were going to be doing marijuana. They were farmers and could grow some really good marijuana. And we know this happened because my grandfather actually caught them at one time on his farm. And so the plan was they were going to go to Mexico and they were going to farm it for Mickey, and it was going to come in. And this is well known. It was well known in Los Angeles that Mickey actually did this with other people. And then, of course, he gets, the heat put on him from the Kennedy brothers, winds up in prison himself. And during that time frame, they needed money. They wind up robbing a bank to sustain them while they were waiting for this heat to come off of Mickey. And of course, you can see the story as it went forward.
So there's this whole undercurrent society that they're part of, that they keep meeting the same people in this prison, then another prison, and so on and so forth. And then they go to Alcatraz one at a time, and then they all end up at Alcatraz. It's like a small community of criminals.
Well, when you watch the movie The Escape from Alcatraz, 95% of it is false. The other 5 is maybe halfway true. But, I love the movie myself. I'm a big fan of the movie. Loved to watch it. Watched it many times. But you gather from the movie that, the first time that John and Clarence meet Frank Morris is in Alcatraz, right? No, they knew Frank Morris and Wes from other prisons. They actually spent time together with them in Florida State prisons in Rayford. So it wasn't like they knew this was, I just meeting you. No, they already knew each other. And they had already done other escapes together. Yeah. So it wasn't like this was the first time they ever met. And that was what was a little, misleading from the movie, from actually what happened.
Yeah.
That's
And
just
then-
one of them.
And when Mickey Cohen showed up, they'd already been, he used to be their boss.
Yes,
Right.
yes. Mickey shows up and finances their escape.
Right, right. And arranges for a boat to. So, why don't you tell a little bit about the story of, how they planned their escape off of Alcatraz? The warden, of course, told them nobody ever escapes. We take people who escape from other prisons, put them here so that nobody ever gets out. Anybody that tries dies in the water because it's so cold.
Well, like I said, I can talk forever. I won't Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
Boy, there's so much to say about that. One of the things that, again, sort of contrasting with the movie, in the film, Frank Morris sort of comes up on his own idea that, hey, I think I figured a way off the island. Well, actually, it was John that was really the leader of the group. It's in the FBI report that he was seen as the one that was really making the decisions, because like Ken said, even before Alcatraz, when they were doing their federal time for the bank robbery, eventually both John and Clarence end up at Leavenworth. At Leavenworth Prison. And they both were working in the bakery area because they discovered that if you work in the bakery, that they were baking the bread at the prison, and the containers that the bread were in were sent to other local jails. They would give them the bread. Well, then they tried to escape there by putting, Clarence put himself in one of those containers, and he was going to be wheeled out and put on the truck and then break out of there. Well, he was caught, and
But he was packed in with bread all
he was
around.
packed with all the bread. He gets caught, and he's sent to Alcatraz, and then of course John is too. They didn't catch John, but they suspected he was a part of it, because these brothers are trouble.
And well, the brothers got better at escaping than that. After.
Yes.
They
They
learned.
got much better.
And one of the things that's really funny too is the warden at Leavenworth Prison told the warden at Alcatraz, do not put the brothers together, because at Alcatraz, as a federal prison, it was unusual because in other federal prisons, two inmates were in the same cell. But at Alcatraz, you had your own cell. If you've been to the island, you see these prisons these cells were very small, and it can only hold one person. He says, do not put them together because they will try and escape. Well, the warden does it anyway because he felt that the security measures are so strong that there's no possible way they will ever get out, so I don't have to worry about escape. So when John is being sent to he went there first before Clarence arrived, he was already thinking about his plan of escape. Because he wrote a letter, because Ken's mother collected all the letters that they
Yes, we
wrote
have all
from
the
prison,
letters.
which are a number of them are in the book. And one of the letters that he made a little joke saying that on the transport boat that was taking him to the island, it was going in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
It was taking him to the island, not from the island. So that's kind of telling us that he's already starting to think about a plan of escape. And when Clarence arrives, that's when the plan really starts going into motion, that it was through John and not Frank that came up with the idea. But the thing that really set the escape plan forward is when they meet the fourth person of the team, and that was Alan West. Alan West was a car thief who tried to break out of prison in Florida, and then he gets sent to Alcatraz. Because in Alcatraz, nobody was ever, when you were convicted of a crime, you were never sent to Alcatraz. No. You're always sent to another federal prison, and if you were a troublesome inmate, if you tried to escape, you're just causing difficulties, they would send you to Alcatraz. So it was kind of the worst of the worst. And so Alan West tried to escape from prison in Florida, gets caught, and he gets sent there.
It's interesting that so many of the prisoners in Alcatraz at that time were not murderers. And
Most of them were bank robbers.
Bank robbers.
Yeah,
that was the big crime.
There were some bad people in
Sure.
there, but not every one of them were.
yeah.
So,
Well,
so
Al Capone was there.
Yeah.
yeah. But he's John and Clarence are thinking about, what are our possibilities? Well, Alan West was sort of a handyman kind of a person, and he had freedom of movement in the prison because he would kind of do little fix-up jobs around the prison. And one of the things, the way the prison is situated is you have the cell blocks and their backs are against each other, and there's a little utility corridor between on the back sides of the prison, and they had done some plumbing work. A plumber had come in, was doing some repairs. And so they sent Alan West in there to kind of clean up the mess and pick up any pieces and, just kind of make sure everything was cleaned up there, because the guards didn't like to go in there. It was very dark, it's very dusty and dirty, and they'd send the prisoners to do the work. And he found a bag that had files and saw blades there that an inmate years before had left there and just never retrieved. And so when he finds these things, he realized, okay, we could use these on the island, because he was also thinking about escape. And he goes to John, and he says, hey, I found these tools that maybe we can get something going. And that's when the escape really starts happening, because they had the tools to start thinking like, okay, we can start, because they were thinking about trying to go out the front with the bars, but it's hardened steel. Well, they had realized that behind the cell block was the little air vent. And the movie does accurately portray what happens as far as, using the kitchen, using the tools from the kitchen, the spoons and the blade or the handles and so forth, to try to, because they realized that the cement had softened over time because of the salt air, because the prison opened in 1934, and this is in early 1960, 61. So this is almost 30 years later. So the cement had softened over time, and so when you start chipping away, it chipped away fairly easily. And then when you had the files and the saw blades, that made it even a faster process, and they started planning their way out through the back of the cell.
But one of the things I like about their planning is that they drew from experiences from childhood. So, like for instance, the dummy heads. We know that when they were kids, now my grandfather was a very, very strict individual. He believed in two punishments, the belt and, if you got caught, you got in trouble. And sometimes he would even whip you even when you didn't need to be in trouble. He was just that kind of a person, or a vet from World War I. My grandmother always thought that kind of changed him a little bit. But regardless, the way that John and Clarence would slip out of the house, their older sister back then, I don't know if you even ladies remember this, but they used to wear wigs, and they had the old styrofoam wig head. They would take the wig head with the hair on it, and they would lay it in the bed to make to fool their grandfather, their father, when they were wanting to slip out and go do whatever they were doing. So, you can kind of almost see some of that whenever, because they actually create the heads very similar to what they used to do as children. Then you go into like the towing of the boat. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, when they were kids, they were, like I said, they were very poor. And I used to always think of John as like the MacGyver of the 1940s and 50s. You got to think they came from an environment where they didn't have, a lot of material. They made do with whatever they had. And so my mom would talk about how that, because they were the older siblings and they would watch the younger siblings. They would make toys for their kids, or like John and Clarence made their own bicycle. I mean, they didn't go down and buy it. They created it. So they would take something and make something out of it. And you see the same ingenuity in the escape. Like they make a homemade flashlight because they're in the corridor and it's dark and they're working on stuff when they need light. So John creates a flashlight. They make a periscope so that they can use to look out the vent whenever they are getting ready to go onto the roof when the night that they escape. But they learned as children, they used to go down to, and they did this with one of their childhood friends who eventually becomes very an important part in the escape. He flies them out of, he's the one who actually flies them out. But as kids, they would go down to the local docks where I don't know if you've ever seen the Tampa Bay. It's very similar to the bay here, is that they have several rivers that feed into it, and there's one way in and out of it, which is through the Sunshine Bridge between St. Petersburg and Bradenton. But so as kids, they would go down to this dock, and these people would be coming through this what they call the Alafai River, and heading out into the bay, and they would hide up under the docks, and when whoever was going out would park their boats, they would go up behind it and they would wrap a rope. They used to say the rudder. Back then it was a rudder, but it was like the engine. And they would wrap a rope around it and they would hide up under the docks on a piece of wood. And then when the person took off, well, they would try to ski behind it as long as they could until either they fell off or the person driving the boat would see them. And so this is exactly what they did in the escape. Early on, even John mentions to a fellow inmate that's later interviewed by the FBI, John mentions to him, well, we could use the prison boats as a means of getting to the mainland. So even then, you can see all of these experiences from their childhood is brought forward into this escape. And from there, I mean, it's some of the stuff is just totally amazing what they did.
I love it that they use a 100-foot-long electric cord as something to tie up onto the boat, and then they tied it to their raft. Now,
Yes.
how they built the raft is also very interesting. Why don't you tell, how do they create a raft that they could take out of the prison? I mean, a raft is a big thing. I particularly like the concertina part of this. But so they built these rafts, and how did they do it?
Mike, why don't you answer that one?
So what they did was they used the raincoats that, because the island is cold and it's wet and it's rainy, each prisoner was issued a raincoat, and it's made of rubber, obviously. And so when they decided on using because the main problem for Alcatraz was, if you got out of the prison, if you somehow broke out, because there were previous prison escapes where people would be like near the dock, they jump in the water, they try to swim for it, or there was actually another person who swam, he made it to the bottom of the Golden Gate Bridge where he was caught and brought back. So people had a way of escaping. The problem was the water. It was a moat for the island. The water, I mean, if you've been in the bay, it's very cold. You can't last very long before hypothermia sets in. And also the guards were telling the inmates about the sharks that are inhabiting the bay, and that, of course, all the sharks, they were telling the prisoners, were man-eaters, and they were going to be chomped up into little bits. That's not true, but that's what the inmates believed. And so they realized that if we're going to swim for it, although Ken hasn't mentioned this, but John and Clarence were actually very good swimmers.
Very good swimmers.
They could swim for several miles very easily because they grew up they loved the water. They were fish, basically, and they would swim in the bay regularly as children growing up, and they even won a couple contests for swimming. So swimming was not a problem for them, but the tides are a problem for the bay. And whenever you see a documentary about Alcatraz or some kind of book that's written, they always talk about how the tides worked against them. Well, the brothers realized that they don't have to worry about the tides, so what they did was they constructed a raft out of the raincoats. Now, Frank Morris, who was very intelligent, his part of the plan was he used to read Popular Mechanics, that the inmates, one of the privileges they had was if they were, not causing problems, they can have access to the library. And so he would have Popular Mechanics. Well, there's this one article that talked about how they used to vulcanize rubber. And when they were before the actual escape, they dug out the back of the cell. Ken talked about the dummy heads. They would put the dummy heads in the beds at nighttime. When the guards would walk by, they would think that they were asleep in their beds because they turn off their lights, and you kind of see this figure, this shape in the bed. And so the prisoner's still there. Well, they're actually on top of the cell block. That was their staging area where they were constructing everything. Well, they would take the raincoats to the top, and they would cut them up and sew them together because they knew how to sew. And then the pipes for the water went over the top, and it was the cold water and the hot water because they needed the hot water for the showers. Well, they would use the hot water pipes to vulcanize the rubber. They'd sew it and then melt it together, and then they shaped a raft out of the raincoats. And one of the things that's really funny about the story is that there was a person that was in charge of materials that inmates would need from time to time. So if an inmate lost their raincoat, you would go to this person, I need a new raincoat, or it's got a tear in it, I need a new raincoat. And they said on average you get about 2 or 3 raincoats per year that needed replacing. Well, in the weeks and months leading up to the escape, as John and Clarence and Frank Morris and Alan West are getting raincoats, because they needed approximately 50 raincoats to construct the raft. Well, they said that in like a several-month period, they something like 40 raincoats were requisitioned by, from the inmates, because either they were stealing them or asking for them. And they were not thinking like, something's going on here. They were not suspicious. They, okay, sure, whatever's going on with the raincoats.
You need extra? There you go.
So anyway, they constructed the raft on top of the cell block over a period of many different weeks.
So they're going out of their own cells all the time in order to get up, into this corridor between the backs of the two cells and to get up onto the top. And then that's where they built everything. And they did it they chipped their way through the grill, and then they put fake grills there so that they could put the fake grills in all the time and then take them out, made out of cardboard. And West didn't quite get his chipped away.
Well, so, this was,
The fourth guy.
yeah, someone actually asked me one time, not here recently, because James Whitey Bulger, who was there with them and was very good friends with them, they wanted to know why didn't Whitey Bulger go with them, since he was really kind of part of this. And it was really because it was like a two-man operation. You couldn't just have one person. You had to have, as they would tell, as Wes is telling the story, if you're digging in your cell, your next roommate, who is part of it, would watch out for you while you're digging, and then they would take turns. So you always had to have someone to watch for the guard coming to say, hey, you need to quit, get back up in your bed or whatever. And so, when the plan actually starts off, it's John and Clarence are the ones who's doing this. And because John is the first one out the back of his cell, but Wes decides, okay, I need to start doing this, but he couldn't do it by himself. So that's when Frank Morris is invited. He invites Frank Morris, which is Hal's right beside him, to join the group because he needed someone to watch for him. So it made sense to do Frank Morris. So that's when he becomes a part of the plan. The plan's actually already kind of going. And John and Clarence, John's actually makes it out the back of his cell first, and as soon as he gets there, he goes and retrieves the files and the hacksaw blades that Wes had found behind the corridor. He retrieves them, brings them to his cell, and then he constructs the fake grill. So he makes one for himself. Clarence at that time gets out second, and he makes a fake grill for him, for his cell. And he's actually the very first one to go up to the very top. He goes all the way to the very top of the cell house. They haven't, roped it off with blankets yet, so it's very risky because a guard could have easily have seen him. Mm-hmm. But he goes up there and he quickly looks at the vent and realizes, yeah, we can do this. Comes back down. Well, then they quickly realize, well, we need some way to, we can't just leave and be gone for a while. We need something to put in the bed. So that's when they start making the heads. And little is known as John and Clarence make all of the heads. They make the heads for Frank Morris. They make the heads for Allen West and for themselves. And they actually nickname all of their heads. All of the heads have nicknames. Mm-hmm. And I surprised an FBI agent one time when she was kind of bragging about the heads, and it was actually the same heads. And she says, this one's named Ornk. And I said, well, do you know why it's named Ornk? Mm-hmm. And she was like, oh, no. Well, they nicknamed them, they named them nicknames they used as kids. Ornk was who they used to call Alfred. When he was on hiding out from a previous escape, the family used to refer to him as Oink because they didn't want to actually use his name in front of other people, so they had nicknames. So they nicknamed all of the heads. They even make the fake grate for Frank Morris. I don't want to downplay, like Mike said, I don't want to downplay Frank Morris's role in this. He was very instrumental in a lot of this stuff. But that's where you get from people who watch this movie, or they listen, they read a book that someone wrote based upon the movie or something else, and they go, oh yeah, Frank Morris was the brains behind this. And I even had a person challenge me one time and say, well, it's well documented and well known that Frank Morris is the brains behind this outfit. And I say, well, what document are you referring to? Show me where you get that from. What official document is this listed in? It's not. The only time it's ever mentioned is Olin Blackwell is interviewed by a newspaper right after the escape, and he makes the comment, well, Frank Morris had an IQ of 136, so I probably feel like he was the leader and the mastermind behind this. And that's where it came from. Mm-hmm. And so Mike and myself, and I challenge him, we don't go to newspapers to do this. We pull everything from the FBI reports. One of the first things the FBI did the next morning when they came in and took over the criminal or the crime scene, because it was a crime scene, is that they interviewed every single inmate in Alcatraz. And then they go and they interview every single inmate that John and Clarence ever had any contact in other prisons, all the way down to Florida. Interview, you know, all of the, so these interviews that they did with these prisoners, they're the ones who's telling the story. You know, I mean, one inmate says, well, yeah, John came to me early on and said that the prison boats might be a means of escape off of the prison, you know, out of to the mainland. And then another prisoner came in when they interviewed him and said, well, John mentioned to him that they were going to use alternate clothes. They were going to paint some clothes black so they wouldn't be seen. And then another inmate says, well, you know, of course, if there's any leader and a mastermind behind this, it was John. It was the older England brother. And then, of course, West tells the story, and it's all about John planning this, nothing to do with Frank Morris. And so, you know, all of what we bring is just simply what's in the FBI files. We didn't use any newspaper clipping that someone said, oh yeah, well, Olin Blackwell said this, and so it must be true. You know, I mean, they did this under his nose. Do you really want to believe anything he's got to say? So, what I say.
Your uncles weren't in school long enough to get an IQ test, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, and we all know, you know, I mean, I'm a poor person at taking a test. You know, you give me a test, I could probably fill it. But you know, there's a difference between someone being able to take a test and pass it and someone who's got common sense. And John and Clarence came from that environment where that common sense sometimes is a lot smarter than a book. I'm not saying I downplay education, because I don't. I'm just saying that a lot of times, just because you have a high IQ and you know how to take a test doesn't mean that you know that you have that common logical thinking sense. So,
Well, we have not enough time for the rest of the really cool stories. So,
I have a lot. I have a lot more.
I do want to show the rest of the pictures, though, because
let's see what other I have here. Okay,
this Alcatraz.
Yeah. So, gosh, if you look at Alcatraz, and I always like to think, what in the world do the park rangers tell people about the no one can escape and, you know, swim to freedom this coming Sunday when 2,000 people, which I've done it myself, is positioned right along here, and they jump into the water and they swim to the mainland.
Right.
Because I did it myself, you know, and I had never done it before in my life. So I wonder what they say when they go and they're telling these people this can't be done, and they see 2,000 people doing it, you know.
Oh, everyone's a lot better athlete now than they used to be.
Oh, is that what? Yeah. So the year that I did it in 2016, I called the U.S. Marshal. I thought it was going to be funny. I said, well, I just did it. And you're telling me my uncles couldn't do it, and here I am. I'm 57 years old, and I just did it. And he goes, well, you had a wetsuit. And I said, well, okay, not everybody who went into the water had wetsuits. I saw some people go in without a wetsuit. And I even saw some people went in, I guess they were like, had been injured in military. They only had, I saw one guy do it with one arm. He had no arm, no legs, and one arm, and he swam across it. And then he came back and he said, well, it was at night when they did it. And I said, oh, well, did I tell you there was a blind guy who did it? So for him, that was at night. You know, so, you know, he just finally kind of gave up and said, I'm not going to argue with you anymore. But so you can see the docks, you know, where the prison boat would have been docked at. And they come up under those docks and they tie to that back of that prison boat, just like they used to do as kids. And they're in that raft up under those docks. The person in the tower can't even see them now. And this is dark, you know. When that prison boat leaves and comes out around this way, heading to where they would dock the prison boats, they only have to make it just past that corner of that prison. Because that's a reason why they let 2,000 people on Sunday off at that location, and why they don't let them off over here. And it's because most of the current goes that direction. You know, and this direction, if you go in here, you can actually make it to the mainland. And you go in this way, you'll never make it to Angel Island. Never.
I like that when they're escaping, they get off, they use blankets to put over the barbed wire, they get over the fences, 2 fences, and then they've got this boat, the raft, they inflate the raft, etc., but they left behind a 100-foot coil of electrical wire, which they were going to use to tie on the back of the boat. And one of them runs off and finds the same thing, another 100-foot of coil.
At the docks.
Back at the docks, and then runs back.
And it's reported in the FBI file that 150 feet of electrical cord was missing
Right.
from the docks. So we know that happened.
Yeah. All right. So let's
see what the next
more pictures. Okay.
Oh, so yeah.
This is what the wonderful.
Yeah, so, you know, one of the things that how many of y'all have actually heard, so I challenged someone one time before, and it used to be comical because I would always, anybody who came in said, well, I don't believe they made it. And I would always go, well, tell me why you don't believe it. You know, what evidence did you ever see that was produced that makes you believe that? And half the time I have to give them that evidence. Most of the time they don't even know they don't even know why they believe it. They just go, I just believe it that way. And it really, and for the longest time, I actually thought this, that the only reason why they started putting it in the newspaper and the prison people started, James Bennett, who is the director of the prisons at that time, he's the first one who says it. They find a few days later this pouch floating in the water. And inside of this pouch are letters, photos. I'm actually in one of those photos, believe it or not. Because, you know, my mom had written them and when I was born, and they sent my picture. And my sister's actually in one of those photos. But so, you know, they find letters, photos, they find other items that was pieces of paper that people they were going to contact, and they find it floating in the water. Well, James Bennett goes, this proves that something happened and the raft fell and they all drowned because this was very important to the escapees, undoubtedly. They were taking it with them and they would not have just discarded it lightly. Something must have happened and they drowned, and that's the reason why we found this pouch in the water. You know, and I was for one time I actually said, you know, I can believe that. You know, I mean, if this was important information for John to carry, something must have happened for him to lose that pouch. So one of the things that I love about what happened in the investigation, the very next morning when they discover the escape, the FBI comes in and they take pictures of the cells, all the cells before anything's moved, you know, other than what the guards came in there and moved around. But some of the things, so this, you're looking at Clarence's cell right now. The reason I know it's Clarence is because he played a guitar. And one of the things you can notice in this cell is that you got his pea coat hanging off the side back there. So whenever he left that night, he did not take his coat with him. And actually, there's another picture, I think it's, you can actually see his raincoat. So he didn't take his raincoat with him either. He didn't even use his raincoat in making the stuff, his own raincoat. You can see his shirt that he would use if he was going out to work. So he didn't take his shirt with him. And there's actually a white shirt you see laying on that, right up under the table where you would write from. So did he go out the back of his cell with no clothes on? Because he didn't take any of his clothes with him. And then if you go to the next photograph, this is John and Clarence. Let's see if we have another one. Okay, so this is John's cell. And I have a picture of Frank Morris's cell, same way. He didn't take his coat. He didn't take his raincoat. You can't really kind of see his clothes. But in John's cell, this is amazing because not only can you see his shirt on one side, you can also see his raincoat. You can see the other shirt, the white shirt that's wrapped around the sink. Okay, you can actually see on the opposite side of the bed, that's his pants with his belt still in it. So all three men go out the back of their cell with no clothes on other than their underwear. So that really backs up what we were saying is that they had alternate clothes. They had some other clothes up on top of the cell house, which backs up what Whitey Bulger tells us tells me that he showed them how to make wetsuits out of the clothes. He showed them how to take a pair of clothes and paint the inside of it with a rubber cement, tying off the legs to it and the shirt, that would prevent water from coming in and out. That's what a wetsuit does. It prevents that water flow, or slows it down, rather. And so we know they had other clothes. John had already talked about having clothes that had been painted black. He'd already mentioned this to another inmate. But I also want you to notice something else in this cell. What do you notice in this cell? Now, it's not as clear. I've got some photos that are a little bit clearer than this. But, so, you remember I told you that when they found the pouch, right, all of John's letters are in the pouch, along with all the photographs, right? Oh, but except they're sitting right there. This is the next morning. So all of those letters, which have all of the photos in it, that supposedly he took with him that night, right, and he loses it in the bay, well, how the heck is it sitting here the next morning? And right up on top of the letters, you see that little brown thing? That's a raincoat sleeve. That is the exact same material that they find the letters in the bay a couple of days later. Well, tell me, anybody explain to me how that happened? I mean, give a wild guess. Did John come back the next day and go, dang it, I forgot that, And so he gets it and goes back out again. How did that end up in the bay and they find it, but yet it's there the morning after the escape?
Well, you can't call it planted evidence because it was drowned evidence. It wasn't planted anywhere.
And then I go back into this. So, when they find the pouch floating in the water, one of the things they do is they cut it open. It's listed in the document, and it's full of water. And then what really made me start like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. So, because when they find the life preserver, all of them, all three, even the one that was cut, they patch it, they fill it full of air, they put weights on it, and it held air for several hours. And then they take the boat that was left behind, because there was actually two rafts. They had started one, and then they switched and did another one, right at the very end, right after Mickey Cohen comes back. But so they take that one and they fill it full of air, and it holds air, and put weights on it, and it holds air for a long time. So if that pouch was so important to John, he did a poor job at putting it together. If he was so good at putting those life preservers together and that raft that they could hold air for hours, but yet he creates something that is so important, supposedly, to him, and it's flooded with water, well, he didn't do a very good job at putting it together, did he?
Oh, we're all out of time except for, I know there must be some questions that people have. Is there a mic, Dan? Yeah, we'll go over just a couple more minutes. Does anybody want to ask them a question? The rest of the book will tell you how they wrapped the cord around the prison boat, got out into the water, got picked up by Mickey Cohen's boat, got put on a plane and flown, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of evidence of how it could go down. So who wants to ask the first question? We have one, somebody back here? It's hard to see. Any questions? All right. Who's got the microphone? Okay, right in front row here in the middle. And then one over here. We'll take two questions. We've already run out of time, but let's do two questions.
So I'm jumping forward a little bit in the story, knowing where it ends, and part of this is because of what the most recent television program that you did. So I'm curious if there's any chance that you can move the narrative forward in your investigation, particularly thinking about your relationship with the Brazilian government. Is there any way that the U.S. State Department can intervene and help you with that?
Yes, I will share something with y'all that we're not going to share, never shared with anybody else yet. I told you there's a Timor coming. Part of this wanting to know what happened after is that we know for a fact that they married and had children. So I know I have cousins down there. And so we are very, very, very close to finding who they are and where they're at. So as we find them and make contact with them, introduce ourselves, we'll get the backstory of what happened after you saw that photograph being taken. And hopefully we'll have other photos of either their grandfather or their father. So we are close to doing that. The Brazilian government was very hesitant. They fought me a lot trying to do a DNA test into there because they have a very private database system down there that is only for Brazilians. You cannot submit anything in there outside of the Brazilian people. And if you do and they find out about it, you can be charged and sent to jail. So they took it very, very serious. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this, because I actually tried to do it several times. And they eventually turned me down and said, don't do it again. I said, okay. So, so with some help of some other people down there, we're very close, hopefully, of tracking down my relatives.
One last question.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the picture there.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's my understanding they went and they dug out with utensils under the, is that a raincoat?
If you're looking
right
at
there?
the little towel, I think that's
Yeah.
either a towel or
The white
actually
towel in the
that's
back?
a shower, like something you wear when you went to the shower. Yeah, so like it's covering the hole. The hole is actually there. Yeah, and they actually dug it out with. John winds up trying it with one spoon. He files one end of the spoon down, and he realizes he can't do it with that. So he goes and steals. He works in the kitchen at this time, so it was easy for him. Still, he gets 2 more spoons. He files them down, and he wraps them together with tape. And so he makes almost kind of like it's 3 spoons together, and that's what he was used to eventually make headway into the concrete.
The other nice little detail was that one of them worked in the barber shop, and they
Yes.
watched to make sure that they didn't take hair with them when they went out, but he kept the hair in the cuffs of
The
his
cuffs
pants.
of his pants. He would let it fall down into the cuff of his pants, and he would take it out back to the cell, and that's what they used for the hair on the dummy heads. And then, of course, which a lot of people don't know, is John and Clarence were very good artists, and you ought to see the paintings that we have. But John painted his girlfriend and her sister, and he used that paint to paint the dummy heads. That's where he got the flesh tone paint. He painted on the dummy heads and also for the grates. And Clarence painted a rock scene with water crashing upon it, and he used that to paint different items. Believe it or not, they actually sent those paintings home to us, so we actually have them. Very, very nice paintings. I mean, beautiful paintings. I did not know they were that great of an artist.
So now I finally discovered your motive for all this. You think that there's a cache of art down in Brazil that might be worth a lot of money.
Very well could be.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Ken and Mike. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 121st year of enlightened discussion. Thanks a lot for coming. Come back again. Thanks again.
Thank you.